In today's session, we are concerning ourselves with mind and body in war, which is to say that we are turning our attention to the psychic and somatic experience of war. How have body and mind fared in battle? How has war shaped our knowledge of body and mind? How have military institutions developed techniques and means by which they can exert control over these bodies and minds? One could begin our inquiry by noting that war is, of course, an intense physical and mental experience. The battlefield is an assault on the senses, with its vivid sights, its noises and sounds, its smells and stenches, the general chaos and confusion that assaults and overwhelms sensorial perception. It is also the site of conditions of extreme physical exertion, where bodies are strained, worn, wounded, maimed, or disfigured. Skin may be lacerated or burnt, bones splintered, limbs severed, organs pierced, and all manner of bodily fluids spilled. And of course, war brings with it a mental stress, the fear of dying, and yes, of killing, the trauma of battle and loss. And so our first question for us is, how have medical and psychiatric practice dealt with the casualties of war, notably when they've been tasked with serving military expediency? What tensions have arisen between the medical commitment to care for the injured and the demands of the military machine to support its war effort and to patch up soldiers to fight again? And if war is such a potentially disabling experience, how have armies ensured the coherence, reliability, and obedience of troops under such extreme conditions? As we shall see, the instilling of discipline and group cohesion through training and the shaping of the body and mind of the soldier have been key. And so one of the conclusions we'll draw is that war is not merely the occasion of the destruction and maiming of bodies and minds, but also the site of techniques of power in which they are produced and governed. It's obviously the case that war has always presented particular challenges to medical practitioners. First and foremost, because of the very large number and range of injuries sustained in military combat over a very short period of time, injuries in need of desperate medical attention very often. To add to this, practitioners who are tasked with this have tended to operate with limited resources and, of course, in the difficult conditions of a conflict. This relationship between war and medicine is one that was noted all the way back in the 4th century BCE, when Hippocrates, one of the founding figures of medicine as we understand it today, noted that he who would become a surgeon should join the army and follow it. If you want to learn about medicine, if you want to learn about injury, if you want to develop your practice, then the best finishing school is war. And it's certainly true that the demands of battlefield medicine and the subsequent treatments of the war injured have driven a whole raft of innovations that have subsequently diffused themselves into wider practices of peacetime medicine. So whether it's emergency surgery, the use of anesthetics, the transportation of blood, the development of prosthetics and plastic surgery, all of these and more can be traced back to the intervention in conflict areas and the aftermath of war and the treatment of the injured and disabled. We should note, however, already here a certain paradox, which is that medical science has made considerable advances and, in combination with protective clothing, has vastly increased the survivability of troops at war. It is now much more likely that even severe injuries can be survived, whereas in times prior, even fairly minor injuries sustained in the battlefield could quickly lead to gangrene, infection, and death. But with this greater survivability has come new challenges for medicine and for society. For instance, in the First World War, to deal with the devastating power of artillery, troops were equipped with hard helmets that would protect their skulls from potentially lethal shrapnel. And to the extent that it did its job, it did mean that soldiers could survive blasts that previously would have killed them. But many of them survived with very severe injuries to their faces, effectively disfiguring them. The French referred to these individuals as the gueules cassées, the broken faces. And this was one of the drivers of early developments of plastic surgery in the aftermath of the First World War. What to do with all these individuals who came back with terrifying, life-changing facial injuries, and how these could be masked or concealed. More recently, we have seen the development of body armor to protect the main organs, and advances in battlefield medicine, interventions, very rapid interventions to deal with severe injury. And one of the things that's been observed is that it is much easier now to survive even multiple losses of limbs. And this, of course, has become a very significant issue in the recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, where the most devastating weapon used against coalition forces was the IED, the improvised explosive device. And so loss of limbs has actually been a very common injury that coalition soldiers have incurred. And this has created, therefore, a new demand for next generation prosthetics, ones that have become increasingly sophisticated, often of a complex cybernetic nature. And therefore, if we want to find one of the primary sites for the development of these new prosthetics today, it is to be found in the treatment of the mutilated of the 21st century wars. Once again, one of the long-term trends we can observe over the last 100 or 200 years or so, but particularly last 100 years, is a declining ratio of the dead to the wounded. In other words, the percentage of wounded in action who then ultimately die. So if we can see on this graph that there has been a general downward trend. If we start with the First World War, during the First World War, 20% of injured, this is American statistics, were killed as a consequence of their injuries. This has actually increased in the Second World War to 30%. By the time, however, we get to the contemporary wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, this number has fallen to 10%. So in other words, 90% of soldiers survive their injuries. That's not to say that not very large numbers of soldiers have come back with injuries. It's estimated that over 1 million American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan have been harmed in some way. A third of them have suffered traumatic brain injury, often through proximity to explosions, again, of quite commonly IEDs. Consequently, over half of veterans have received government medical care, and nearly as many have applied for permanent disability benefits. So one of the things that we often don't pay much attention to when we think about the cost of war, both the financial cost and the immediate loss of life that is incurred from it, is the very long tail that it produces, because individuals are then liable to need medical treatment for the rest of their lives as a consequence of their war injuries. And this cost of treatment is quite considerable, and of course covered by government spending, including in America, where one of the most reliable ways to get government care, perhaps the only way to get government care, is to serve in the military. And just to give you a sense of how long that tail can be, today the costs of medical care for Vietnam veterans are still rising in the United States. Individuals who fought in the 1960s and 70s, who obviously are now becoming quite aged and who are having medical issues both related to age and to their injuries, This is continuing to put a significant drain on government resources. So the cost of the Iraq and Afghan wars is likely to also continue and to increase over decades in terms of medical treatment. Now, one of the things that we can see emerge as a consequence of the development of battlefield medicine is a progressive rationalization of medical treatment. Because the challenges, of course, of battlefield medicine is that you are generally dealing with limited medical resources, and you need to decide where to allocate those resources. Hence the system of triage. This system of triage is precisely designed to rationalize the allocation of resources. In its simplest form, it classifies the intake of patients according to 3 categories. The first category would be patients whose injuries are so severe that they will die or are likely to die regardless of treatment. The second category are those whose injuries are not so severe and are likely to live regardless of whether they receive immediate treatment or not. All of which leaves a third category, those whose outcome will benefit most from immediate treatment. So quite obviously, it is towards that last category that resources are prioritized. And so there's an attempt to align the provision of treatment with the biggest difference it will make on the prospects of the patient. This was a technique first formalized in the First World War by French doctors, hence its French name, but it was in some shape or form, or at least applied in an unsystematic fashion on earlier battlefields. This triage technique, of course, is now become ubiquitous. Whenever you enter a hospital today in civilian context, you will be submitted to triage. You will be assessed in terms of how rapidly you require treatment. Now, one of the interesting points to note here is that triage in the civilian context certainly is focused on limiting loss of life, preventing complications from illness or injury. But the same system can also be operated according to other rationales. And so it might be that in war, the priority becomes to patch up the lightly wounded so they can rejoin the battlefield. So in other words, rather than treating those who most immediately need treatment to improve their prospects, you treat those who can be most quickly sent back to fight. This is referred to as reverse triage. And this, I think, illustrates 2 things. One is that this rationalization of medical treatment can function while following different objectives, whether it is the long-term well-being of the patient or whether it is the rehabilitation of the patient to perform particular actions here to fight a war. But it also illuminates the tension between medical practice and war imperatives. Medical practice whose central concern is the well-being of the patient, and the military imperative, which is to win a war. Similarly, we might look at the development of national health policies that began in the late 19th century but really ramped up in the first half of the 20th century. Policies around vaccination, the promotion of hygiene, diet, and exercise. And these national health policies, of course, can be seen in a very benign light. They were implemented to improve the general health of the population. But one of the drivers for it was the discovery by governments, certainly with the outbreak of the First World War, that very large segments of the population were unfit to fight. That when armies tried to recruit men into their armies, they realized that very large numbers of these men were so weak, so unhealthy, that they couldn't even be put in the arms. And so the maintenance and the promotion of the health and productivity of the working population became increasingly a matter of national security. So that there is a very self-interested aspect from the state's perspective in promoting national health policies. And of course, this becomes even more necessary when the productivity of the state, of the economy rather, and society becomes essential in the context of total war, where everything in the society gets geared towards the pursuit of war and the support of the war effort. And so the health of the population is not merely a private matter, but one of national interest. Indeed, personal hygiene and health policies extended all the way to the behavior of soldiers. So for instance, the imperatives here, you've got a couple of posters from the Second World War. One that enjoins the population to make our men as fit as our machines through regular physical checkups and blood tests, so ensuring that healthy practices or healthy or regular medical attendance will help to make soldiers more efficient, but also, and this is the second poster, attempting to police the sexual behavior of soldiers. One of the concerns was the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, and so there were various campaigns targeted at soldiers in order to discourage them from encounters which might lead to such infections. Indeed, these policies sometimes went so far as to have military-run brothels, where the girls working there, the women who were employed to service the men, would be kept under regular medical examination to ensure there would be no transmission of disease. All of this, of course, points to an instrumentalization of health for political and military ends. And the manner in which such a instrumentalization enters into tension with the so-called Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath, going back to Hippocrates, is a sermon that all medical practitioners take, and whose main article is that the doctor should always keep the good of the patient in mind as the highest priority. But as we've already established, the good of the patient may not always be aligned with military needs. Doctors may sometimes be required to patch up individuals so they can be sent back to the front, and particularly to combat what is referred to as malingering. Malingering is the simulation, the feigning of medical condition by soldiers in order to avoid serving on a front or returning to the front. So militaries were concerned that individuals who perhaps had received an injury might pretend to have not recovered, or may in fact invent medical conditions in such a way as to avoid returning. And so doctors were expected to detect such instances of malingering. As Sigmund Freud put it, the physicians, this is in the First World War, had to play a role somewhat like that of a machine gun behind the front line, that of driving back those who fled. So here again, to understand that medical practitioners, when recruited into the military machine, can potentially become a mere apparatus of the military machine, or at least servants of the military machine, designed to send soldiers back to the front and avoid any kind of desertion happening through the simulation of disease and illness. Let us turn to the mind and to what we might talk of as the psychiatric casualties of war. The effect of the stress of combat has been known for a long time, but there have been considerable changes in the attitudes towards it and the corresponding treatments that were proposed. In the 19th century, the most common term was that of exhaustion, and it was just thought that soldiers were tired of war, and the manifestation of certain mental symptoms were a consequence of this tiredness, and the treatment would be through rest at the rear. In the First World War, no less than 25% of all discharges individuals who left the military, were labelled psychiatric casualties, and the term shell shock grew to prominence. Now, originally, much of these psychiatric casualties were frequently seen as evidence of individual weakness, a lack of moral fibre. In other words, individuals were cowards, and this was expressed through these psychiatric symptoms. Disciplinary treatment was correspondingly harsh. It involved solitary confinement, shaming, and emotional deprivation. One other form of treatment that developed during the First World War was electroshock therapy. In fact, electroshock therapy might perhaps in some sense be seen as progress, because the basis of the electroshock therapy was a claim that in fact psychiatric casualty or shell shock was not a consequence of a weak character, but actually a physiological reaction. The theory was admitted that it was little fragments, tiny fragments, maybe microscopic fragments of shrapnel that had affected the nerves. This turns out to not be the case, but it was an attempt to understand psychiatric casualty from a medical perspective as opposed to a moral one. Even though then the therapy proposed was that of electric shock. In the Second World War, 500,000 men left the US Army for what became then known as combat fatigue, combat stress, or war neurosis. By then, the ideas of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy had advanced, so that the treatment often took the form of short-term psychotherapy. One study conducted in the Second World War, or after the Second World War, concluded that everyone has a breaking point. The Swank and Merchant study found that after 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of soldiers would become psychiatric casualties, and that the remaining 2% probably had psychopathic tendencies. Or maybe they were warriors, or maybe that's the same thing. Either way, the importance of that study was that it pointed to the fact that these forms of psychological breakdown had nothing to do with the specific character of individuals, but it was actually a fairly universal trait, that combat would simply over time wear down individuals and lead to some form of breakdown. One of the consequences of this was, in the Vietnam War, a decision to shorten tours so that soldiers would not be deployed for longer than 60 days to avoid them becoming psychiatric casualties. And indeed, in Vietnam, there were initially a low level of psychiatric casualties. But after the war, between 500,000 to 1.5 million veterans were eventually deemed to suffer from what became known then as post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe up to a third of total troops. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which is now a very commonly used term and still probably the way in which psychiatric casualties of war are understood, is understood as a delayed reaction to a psychologically traumatic event outside the range of normal experience. And the current forms of treatment provided for PTSD are a combination of counseling and pharmaceutical treatment. It is thought that about a third of returning Iraqi and Afghanistan veterans are being diagnosed with mental health issues, such as anxiety, depression, or PTSD. And so, the toll of these contemporary wars is quite a heavy one when we look at mental health. Now, of course, there's an interesting question as to what the source of mental breakdown is in the context of war. It may, of course, plausibly be caused by the fear of death and injury, or the witnessing of such acts. Crossman suggests another possibility, which is that breakdown or mental strain may in fact be primarily caused by the stress of the expectation to kill and the proximity to those that need to be killed. And this opens up a whole nest of issues that can afflict soldiers. The guilt involved in killing, but also the guilt of not living up to the expectation of killing, and correspondingly of failing comrades. Whether the fear of killing is the primary source of mental strain or not, I think is up for debate. But I think Grossman identifies a very important aspect, which is that killing does not come naturally to most humans and can be a considerable source of strain, and for which there is very little preparation. Indeed, of course, we are normally socialized in our societies to believe that killing is absolutely prohibited, illegal, and immoral. And war, of course, is a context where that prohibition is suddenly lifted.